"I was your son before I was your bank," I whispered as they begged for help. "Now you'll learn what abandonment really feels like," I promised. 6 months later, I watched their lives crumble from the shadows. I'm 34. The day my father called after 5 years of silence, I knew, not what he wanted specifically, but that he wanted something. My fingers trembled against the cold glass of my phone screen, his name pulsing there like an accusation. A ghost summoned from a past I'd tried to bury, my heart trembling. The moment stretched impossibly long, every memory crashed against me. Fragments of what we were, what we could have been, what they destroyed without a second thought, as casually as crushing an insect underfoot. I answered, what else could I do? Curiosity has always been my weakness. That and the foolish hope that maybe, just maybe, he was finally calling to apologize. His voice, gruff, familiar, unchanged, sent a jolt through my system that was almost physical. No apology came, no acknowledgement of the years of silence, just a demand that we needed to talk. When I pressed him for answers, he mentioned trouble, my mother, my sister Emma, all of them caught in some situation they couldn't escape. There it was, not reconciliation, not remorse, trouble. They needed something, and suddenly I existed again. I should have hung up. Should have blocked his number again, and continued the life I'd built without them. Instead, I heard myself agreeing to meet them the next day at noon, a decision my rational mind immediately began to question. That night, sleep evaded me. Memories resurfaced with cruel clarity. Not just the day they cast me out, but all the injustices that came before. The pattern had been established long before my investment mistake. Emma, 16, caught shoplifting. My parents rushing to the store manager, pleading, making excuses about teenage rebellion, paying for the stolen items, bringing her home without consequences. Emma, 19, crashing dad's car while drunk. The way they rallied around her, paid for repairs in secret, protected her from legal repercussions. Emma, 23, dropping out of the college they'd sacrificed to afford, the one I'd been told we couldn't afford for me. She's having a difficult time, they'd explained. She needs our support right now. The pattern continued through her 20s, Emma's mistakes, my parents' rescue efforts, the family finances stretching thinner with each bailout. Never a word of the same forgiveness or understanding for my scholarly pursuits, my career dreams that didn't match their expectations. And then my one mistake, the investment opportunity that promised to solve the financial strain that Emma's needs had created, the chance I truly believed would help us all. I'd convinced them to invest their savings. I'd been so certain. When it collapsed, I didn't just lose money, I lost my identity. My place in the world, my family, the memory of that day haunts my sleep still. The coldness in my father's eyes as he looked at me, not as his son of 29 years, but as a stranger who had wronged him. "Pack your things," he'd said, his voice devoid of the love that had colored my childhood. "You're not my son anymore. No son of mine would destroy his family like this." My mother had stood in the doorway, silent tears tracking down her face, not defending me, not speaking up. Just watching as my father systematically erased me from the family narrative. "But it was a mistake," I'd pleaded, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "I didn't know it would fail. I was trying to help us." "Help," my father had laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "The way you helped is by taking everything we had, everything we worked for. Get out, don't come back." "Mom." I'd turned to her, desperate for intervention, for the fierce protection she'd always shown Emma. She'd looked away. That moment, her gaze sliding from mine to fix on some point beyond my shoulder, cut deeper than my father's rage. Her silence was a wound that would never properly heal. Within an hour, I stood on their porch with a small duffel of hastily packed belongings, 29 years of life reduced to what I could carry. No goodbyes from Emma, who'd stayed in her room throughout the confrontation. No softening from my father, who stood with arms crossed, waiting for me to leave the property. Just my mother's tear-streaked face watching from behind my father's shoulder, her hand half raised as if to wave, then dropping back to her side. I remember the exact moment I started my car. The precise second I realized they weren't going to call me back, weren't going to change their minds. The understanding that home, the concept I'd built my entire understanding of safety and belonging around, had been conditional all along. Rain began to fall as I pulled away from the curb. Perfect. The universe adding atmospheric effect to the collapse of my world. I'd made it 3 blocks before pulling over, the tears finally coming in a flood that matched the downpour outside. I sat there for hours, water streaming down the windows, obscuring the world beyond, mirroring the blur my life had become. In the days that followed, I slept in my car, showered at the gym, applied for jobs during the day, and stared at my phone at night, waiting for it to ring. Waiting for them to realize what they'd done, to reach out, to apologize. The call never came. No birthday acknowledgement that first year. No Christmas card. No response to the letter I sent 3 months after, once I'd found an apartment and a job, explaining again what had happened with the investment, how I'd been deceived along with them, how sorry I was for the pain I'd caused. The silence was absolute, complete. A void where family had once been. I tried once to connect with Emma. Called her cell phone 6 months after the fracture. "I can't talk to you," she'd whispered, her voice tight with what might have been regret. "Dad would kill me. I'm sorry, Alex." Click. Another door closed. I rebuilt my life piece by agonizing peace. Worked 3 jobs until my fingers bled and my back ached with constant fatigue. Slept 4 hours a night to make time for night classes, for certifications that might lead to something better. Landed a position at a tech startup that eventually took off. Created a new family from friends who chose me daily. Bought a home that was truly mine, and all without a single word from the people who had raised me, then discarded me when I failed them. Not a call when I graduated with my master's degree. Not a text when my first major project made industry news. Not a card when I bought my house. A real home in my name only. 5 years of building something from nothing. 5 years of therapy sessions where I cried and raged and mourned the family I'd lost. 5 years of learning to live with the void, to stop expecting it to be filled. And now this, a call from the void. The drive to their house felt like moving backwards in time. The familiar streets of my childhood neighborhood seemed both unchanged and utterly foreign. My hands gripped the steering wheel with unnecessary force, knuckles white against black leather. Breathe, just breathe. I parked at the curb rather than in the driveway. A small act of defiance that only I would understand. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The paint was peeling in places, the front yard overgrown, signs of neglect that would have been unthinkable in the fastidious household of my youth. My father answered, older and grayer, but still straight-backed, still proud. He stepped aside without greeting, allowing me to enter the house that had once been home but now felt like a museum of past hurts, preserved exactly as I'd left it. The living room was just as I remembered, down to the faded floral couch and the family photos on the mantel. I noticed with a strange, detached interest that they had kept pictures of me, as if I had died rather than been exiled. My mother emerged from the kitchen, 5 years carved deep into the lines around her eyes and mouth. Her hair, once richly brown like mine, had gone completely gray. She looked diminished somehow, like life had been steadily eroding her. She whispered my name like a prayer, her eyes, my eyes, everyone always said, filling with tears. My chest tightened painfully. I had prepared for anger, for coldness, even for indifference. I hadn't prepared for this naked vulnerability, this visible breaking. No hug, no touch. I couldn't bear it. She seemed to understand, stepping back, hands fluttering uselessly at her sides. Emma sat on the couch, eyes fixed on her clasped hands. She didn't look up as I entered, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her knuckles whitened with each passing second. My father instructed me to sit down, still issuing commands rather than requests. Some habits never change. I remained standing, demanding they explain why I had been summoned after years of silence. The tension in the room thickened with each passing second, a physical presence pressing against my skin. Emma finally broke, admitting through barely suppressed tears that everything was her fault. The familiarity of this scenario, Emma's mistakes becoming family emergencies, sent a bitter taste flooding my mouth. When pressed, she revealed the truth: gambling debts. $70,000 owed to people who didn't take IOUs or payment plans. People who had already broken into the house, left threats, followed Emma to work. People who had made it clear that payment was non-negotiable. The irony was so perfect it almost seemed scripted. The same people who had cast me out for a financial mistake were now asking me to rescue them from Emma's. The cosmic joke of it might have made me laugh if it hadn't reopened wounds I'd spent years trying to heal. I stood there, feeling the weight of their expectations, their desperation, their fear. The rational part of me, the part that had spent 5 years in therapy working through abandonment and betrayal, screamed to walk away. To let them feel a fraction of the abandonment I had lived with. To show them exactly how it felt to be deemed unworthy of family in your moment of greatest need. But another part, buried deeper, remembered fragments of love before it all went wrong. Being 7 and Emma teaching me to ride a bike, her small hands steady on the back of the seat as I wobbled down the driveway. 14 and Mom staying up all night with me when I had food poisoning, her cool palm against my forehead as she murmured that everything would be okay. Even Dad, proud and unbending as he was, teaching me to change a tire in the rain, his hands guiding mine with surprising gentleness. Those memories, the foundations upon which my understanding of family had been built, couldn't be entirely erased, even by years of silence and rejection. They resided in me still, complicated and contradictory, making simple vengeance impossible. I told them I needed to think, promising a decision the next day. On the drive back to my apartment, my hands shook against the steering wheel, barely holding together. The weight of unspoken truths pressing down, suffocating. That night I barely slept. The memory of my exile played on repeat in my mind, the casual cruelty of it, the way they had discarded me without a second chance, without benefit of doubt, without the loyalty and protection they'd always shown Emma. I had been held to a different standard, always had been. The realization crystallized something in me. Not just anger, though there was plenty of that, hot and righteous, but clarity. They had treated me as disposable once. They would do it again given the chance. This reunion wasn't about reconciliation, it was about utility, my utility to them in this specific crisis. By morning, I had made my decision. Not forgiveness, I wasn't capable of that yet, maybe never would be, but something else. Something that would satisfy both the wounded child within me and the man I had become. I arrived at their house at precisely noon the next day, a manila envelope in hand. They were waiting, the air thick with anticipation and dread. Without preamble, I announced my decision to help, watching relief flood their faces in a wave almost visible to the naked eye. Then I named my terms. I would pay Emma's debt directly, and in exchange, the house would be transferred to my name. They could continue living there, but as tenants, my tenants. The shock on their faces was everything I had imagined during those long, sleepless nights of planning. My father's expression darkened with familiar anger as he accused me of extortion. I corrected him calmly, calling it consequences, something this family seemed to have selective understanding of. The same understanding that had allowed them to cast me out for a mistake while protecting Emma through a lifetime of them. Emma broke first, rising from the couch to accept my terms. She would sign whatever I wanted if it meant making the danger disappear. My parents exchanged a long look, some silent communication passing between them before my father's shoulders slumped in defeat. They agreed to my terms, their capitulation neither gracious nor grateful, but final. I placed the papers on the coffee table, watching as they signed away the home they had once evicted me from. With each signature, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and hollow victory. The house I had grown up in, the setting for both my happiest memories and most profound betrayals, would now legally be mine. As I prepared to leave, my mother caught my arm, a gesture so familiar it sent pain lancing through my chest. She asked if this was all we would be to each other now, landlord and tenants. I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in 5 years. At the mother who had let me go rather than stand against my father's judgment, who had chosen silence over defense, who had protected one child fiercely while abandoning the other. I whispered, "I was your son before I was your bank. You decided that wasn't enough. Now you'll learn what abandonment really feels like." Tears tracked down her lined face as she whispered that they had made a terrible mistake. I agreed simply, "Yes, you did," before walking out, leaving them standing in the house that was now mine, surrounded by the consequences of choices made years ago. The next weeks passed in a blur of legal documents and tense phone calls. I paid off Emma's debt through channels my lawyer assured me were both legal and safe. The house transfer went through without a hitch. My parents and Emma became my tenants, an arrangement that satisfied the part of me that had burned for justice all these years. But as the weeks turned to months, something unexpected happened. The victory I had anticipated, the satisfaction of turning the tables, never fully materialized. Instead, I found myself thinking of them more, not less. The wounds, which I had expected to finally heal once justice was served, seemed to ache with new intensity. Physical sensations became my language, a racing pulse when I checked the rental payments, breath-catching when I saw my mother's handwriting on the envelope, chest tightening when I drove past the house. The body remembers what words cannot. 6 months after that first phone call, Emma contacted me again. Our father had suffered a heart attack, critical condition, might not survive the night. I shouldn't have gone. He had made his choice years ago, had stated in terms that left no room for misinterpretation that I was no longer his son. His medical emergency didn't erase that. And yet, some invisible thread pulled me toward the hospital, toward the man who had shaped me, then shattered me. The hospital corridors were hushed when I arrived, the squeak of my shoes against the polished floor unnaturally loud in the antiseptic silence. My father lay diminished by illness and machinery, his strong frame somehow shrunken under the thin hospital blanket. Tubes and wires connected him to machines that beeped and hummed, measuring the diminishing beats of his heart. He drifted in and out of consciousness. During one lucid moment, his eyes found mine, recognition, and something like regret crossing his pale face. "Alex," he whispered, my name sounding strange in his mouth after so long. I moved closer, uncertain what I was feeling. Anger still, yes, hurt always, but something else too, something I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge in years. Loss. I had lost him long before this moment, before the heart that was now failing him had turned cold toward me. His papery hand moved toward mine, and after a moment's hesitation, I took it. The connection felt both foreign and achingly familiar. "I was wrong," he managed, each word a visible effort. "So wrong about everything." I said nothing, waiting. 5 years of silence deserved more than easy absolution. "The house," he continued, his voice fatting. "There's something you don't know." My mother, who had been sitting quietly by the bed, made a small sound of distress. My father's eyes flicked to her, then back to me. "She doesn't want me to tell you, but you need to know." I frowned, not understanding. "Know what?" "The house," he whispered. "It was always yours. Your grandfather left it to you in his will when you turned 25. We never told you." The revelation hit like a physical blow, rearranging my understanding of the past 5 years in an instant. "What are you saying?" My mother's tears flowed freely now. "Your grandfather always said you were just like him. He left the house to you, not to us, but by then we had already remortgaged it twice, for Emma's rehab, for her legal bills. We couldn't tell you without admitting what we'd done." The truth crashed over me in waves. They hadn't just cast me out for a financial mistake. They had evicted me from a house that was legally mine, had been living in my property while telling me I was no longer their son. When I made the investment mistake, it had been convenient, a reason to cut me off before I could discover their theft. The world tilted sideways with this new understanding. My exile hadn't just been about the failed investment. It had been a preemptive strike. Insurance against the day I might discover their betrayal. My father's fingers tightened weakly around mine. "Forgive," he whispered, but the word faded as his eyes drifted closed, the machines beside him changing their rhythm, beeping with sudden urgency. He died that night. I stood beside my mother as the doctor delivered the news, feeling strangely hollow. In the days that followed, I moved through funeral arrangements in a daze, the revelation about the house coloring every interaction with my remaining family. After the service, I sat with my lawyer, reviewing the documents my mother had finally provided. My grandfather's will, the mortgage papers, the trail of financial decisions that had systematically robbed me of my inheritance while simultaneously punishing me for a far lesser financial misstep. My lawyer confirmed they had no legal right to the property. The house should have been transferred to me 9 years ago. The mortgages they had taken out weren't legal without my signature. The rental agreement I had them sign was actually irrelevant since I already owned the house. Ironically, it strengthened my position, showing they had acknowledged my ownership even if they hadn't admitted how I came to own it. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had demanded the house as payment, not knowing it had always been mine. They had agreed, hoping I would never discover the deeper betrayal. That evening, I met my mother and Emma at the house, my house in every sense of the word. The room felt smaller. Memories larger than the walls could contain. A universe of unresolved emotions condensed into this single, breathless moment. I placed my grandfather's will on the table between us, watching my mother's eyes close briefly in resignation. She had known this moment would come, had been waiting for it since my father's deathbed confession. "You knew," I said simply. "All this time, you knew the house was mine. You knew when you watched Dad throw me out. You knew when you refused my calls, my letters. You knew when you signed those rental agreements." She nodded, unable to meet my eyes. "We were desperate," she whispered. "Emma needed help, the rehab centers, the lawyers. We couldn't afford it. We told ourselves we'd make it right someday. By stealing from me, by making me homeless while you lived in my house." Emma, who had been silent until now, looked up with tear-filled eyes. "I didn't know," she said. "About the will, about any of it, I swear, Alex." I believed her. Emma had been many things over the years, reckless, selfish, irresponsible, but never calculated. The calculation had come from our parents, who had chosen again and again to sacrifice one child for the other. "What happens now?" my mother asked, her voice small and afraid. Will you evict us? The question hung in the air between us, weighted with possibilities. I could evict them, legally, morally justified. I could demand repayment of all the mortgage money they had borrowed against my property. I could pursue criminal charges for fraud. The law, for once, was entirely on my side. I had spent days considering these options, turning them over in my mind, examining them from every angle. Revenge served cold. Justice served legally. But sitting there, looking at what remained of my family, a widow aged beyond her years by secrets and grief, a sister finally facing the consequences of a lifetime of poor choices, I felt something unexpected. Not forgiveness, not yet, but exhaustion with the cycle of hurt and retribution that had defined us for too long. I'm selling the house, I said finally. This place, it's poisoned for all of us. It's built on lies and betrayal and conditional love. My mother's hands trembled. Where will we go? That's not my problem, I said, the words coming out sharper than I'd intended. Then, relenting slightly, the sale will clear the fraudulent mortgages. Whatever's left will split. Half for me, the inheritance that should have been mine, and half for you to find somewhere new. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was an end to the lies, to the house that had become both symbol and prison for all of us, to the darkest chapter of our shared history. My mother wept silently, not with grief, but with something that looked almost like relief. The weight of deception had been crushing her too, in its way. Does this mean? Emma started, then stopped, seeming afraid to finish the question. Does this mean we could try to be a family again? The question pierced me. Family, such a simple word for such a complex, broken thing. I don't know what we are to each other now, I said honestly. I don't know if we can rebuild what was destroyed. Some bridges once burned leave only ashes. It wasn't what they wanted to hear. It wasn't a Hallmark movie ending with tearful reunions and instant forgiveness. But it was the truth. And after so many years of lies and evasions, truth felt like the only solid ground we might someday build upon. The house sold quickly, as I had predicted. I attended the closing alone, signing the final papers that severed my connection to the place that had shaped my earliest understanding of home and family. The money was distributed as promised. Half to me, half to my mother and Emma, who found a small apartment across town. They call sometimes. I answer occasionally. We meet for coffee every few months, careful conversations about neutral topics, exploring the possibility of some new relationship built not on blood or obligation, but on choice and clear-eyed acceptance of what was and what might be. Was this healing, or just another form of breaking? Perhaps both. Perhaps that's what moving forward actually means, breaking open what was to make space for what might be, not forgetting but refusing to be defined by memory alone. Some days I still wake up angry. Some days I imagine what my life might have been if they had made different choices, if they had loved me enough to tell the truth, if I had been son first and convenient scapegoat second. But most days I simply live the life I've built, the successful career, the friends who became family, the quiet dignity of creating something lasting from the wreckage of what was lost. And if that's not victory, it's something close enough to touch. Something that belongs entirely to me. Something they can never take away again.
Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you have any thoughts, I'd love to hear them. So please leave a comment. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want more stories like this one.